Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor hawthorn. Hawthorn is one of the birth month flowers for the month of May, and I cannot wait to show you how I painted this beautiful flower. For this project I am using a piece of Arches 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, my split primary palette in collaboration with Pottery by Eleni, and Letter Sparrow handmade watercolor paints. I will put all the paint names in the caption that I used for this project. Also a size 10 round brush and a size 4 round brush, both Princeton brand. Alright, so let's get started. When I was doing research about hawthorn flowers, they are usually mostly very white, and white flowers can be so tricky. But one of my tricks is to start with the center of white flowers and use the center colors to blend and bleed into the pale flowers, because we're not painting with white, we are painting with other colors, so we are going to be using light washes of color to create a white look to our flower petals. So for the center, I start by adding lemon yellow to some green colors on my palette to get a bright greenish yellow for the dot in the center. And then I surround it with some cad yellow. So it's kind of like a little dot with a pillow of cad yellow around it. And then very quickly, while it's still wet, I'm going to pick up a light wash of color. Now, because I don't clean my palette, which I prefer, I like that, I can choose one of the colors on my palette that I think would work best. So light blues, dusty purples, anything where you can get a very light wash by adding water is going to work great for this. Now, I like tapping in my petals to my center and having that blend in just a bit. It creates a lot of dimension and added color into the flowers as well. So every time I go to pick up some more white in my light washes of blue and purple, I'm picking up more color, letting the center blend in, creating these very circular, easy flower petals, and keeping it at 5, and then moving on to the next flower. So we are going to add more details to the flower in a minute, but we're going to let that dry for now. Same thing here, we're going to start with that really bright green center using the lemon yellow and other blues on my palette to make that bright green. Surround it with the cad yellow for that bright yellow pop, and then pick up a very light wash of color to start making the petals and tapping that in while everything is still wet. I like to use light blues and light purples, like I said before, but you could really use any light wash of color that you like, because white is really just reflecting the colors around it. So you could do a light green if you wanted, light reds, light tans, anything like that. I just prefer this kind of light bluish red because I think it looks really natural and shadowy, and it makes it look really white. I want to use a light wash, but also if I have too much water, the center is going to bleed and blend too much into the flower. So you can see I tap onto my paper towel often, and I pick up some of the pigment and move it off of my brush. Now, I thought, let's add some more of this brighter blue while it's still wet, and I liked the way it looked on the really wet flower, and then when I went into the more dry flower, I got hard lines, which I really liked as well. I like how both look. So I thought, let's wait for this flower to dry some more, and we can add some more of those harder blue lines on that flower as well. Just above these flowers here, I'm using the same bluish gray wash to create some circles for flower buds. Now, this bluish color that I have on my palette, it's a mixture of more of a brighter phthalo blue mixed in with some purples and cad reds and maybe a little bit of green. So I would just kind of experiment with some different gray colors that you can mix together to create light washes, to create something that you like for this particular subject. We're going to do one more flower. This flower, we're kind of seeing some of the petals from the side. I always like including a flower that's more from the side instead of having everything straight on. So I've kind of made the center a little bit more flat, and I'm going to create the petals that are big and full that we can see more clearly along the back, 3 along the back, just like we did before. But these 2 on the side here are going to be a little bit more flat. They're not quite as full here and on the left side because we're going to need room for our half petals. So when we paint the petals along the front, we're going to create these half circle moon type shapes, 2 together. Make sure to leave a little bit of white space. That is the trick to getting it to look like they are petals that you're seeing more from the side. I picked up some of that purplish blue color again, tried to add it in. It's still a little bit too wet. Went back to this one on the top, and it has dried enough that I can start adding some details. So with white flowers, it's all about adding shadows and depth and details and contour into the flower petals, the white petals. So we can add some with the blue, and also we can add a little bit of that bluish purple on the side of the buds as well. Also, I noticed that my center on this bottom flower was a little bit more watery, so I went in and added more of the cad yellow and the bright yellow green to make sure that it didn't dry super dull, and then added that to the other centers as well. Just really fiddling around and making sure I've got everything where I want it before I start on the greenery. For the greenery, the first color I picked up was ultramarine blue, and then I mixed in some cad yellow to get this very dark, deep olivey green. Now, I feel like the greenery is a very trust the process type moment. You don't want too much texture, and you don't want it to be too solid. You don't want it to be one color. And so when you have this weird gap between flowers and hawthorn is more in a bunch, we need to figure out how to fill this space between flowers and make it look good. So I kind of added a few strokes in between the flowers, and then I focused on adding some of this greenery that's hugging up on the buds. My buds were a little bit damp, and so instead of being really nice stark lines, they blended out a little bit. I think this ended up being a happy accident in the end, because if you get that result, you can always just wait for it to dry, go back over it to create that crispness later when it dries. But sometimes it's nice to have that layered, blended look at the bottom. I picked up some ultramarine blue and mixed that into my green and used this new darker color to outline some areas around the flower petals. Now, I didn't do every area in the center because, again, I don't want this to be just a complete solid mass of green in between. But one of my favorite things to do is outline white flower petals with this deep, beautiful green color, or any green color really, because it's such a nice trick to be able to super define those petals even further after you've painted them in such a light wash. My trick with creating the greenery in this area, because it's going to be so thick and blocky, is to change up my color. So before I added this new color, I mixed in some lemon yellow and cad yellow into this green, and I'm going to continue to change it up as I'm painting more and more leaves. Adding yellow, adding cerulean, adding indigo, and adding water. So we're going to bounce around to different flowers so that each flower has a defined leafy area, because we want it to feel balanced. And when I start creating a long, really full leaf like this, I can mix in some darker blues for contrast and balance areas that feel full with smaller leaves next to it. So this area felt too heavy, but adding those few squiggles of tiny leaves up above it really balances it out. And now we're getting very heavy along the bottom, so we can add a few smaller squiggles for balance as well. Just remember that the more gaps you leave, the more chaotic it looks. So make sure that some of your leaves are really hugging the edge of your flower petals, and then some of your greenery can skip over it. So for example, right here, I'm really hugging the greenery around the top flower, but I'm not bringing it down to the flower just below it, and I think that juxtaposition looks really nice. It's going to look too filled in Like a coloring book, if you match the green to the top and the bottom flower, and it doesn't give any room for the flower to breathe, if that makes sense. We've already defined the flower. We don't have to completely define it with the green in every single spot. And same with this spot here on the left. I can add a big flower that really hugs and defines one of the petals, but it doesn't continue on to the left and connect to that other leaf because that would look odd. We don't want to outline all of our flowers with green. And because that leaf on the left was a little bit too dark, I can add another leaf next to it that has more of the warmer yellows in it to create another nice bit of contrast. I also like to make sure I have contrast and texture within the stroke. For this leaf up here, it's got a nice rough edge, leaving some gaps for white space. Because the flower petals are so nice and smooth, we have room to create texture in the leaves. Also remember, we can add bright light green leaves as well that are more watery, especially around this flower bud down here on the bottom. It was on the lighter side and I knew I needed to define it with some kind of greenery, but the greenery all around it was very dark and intense in contrast. So I decided to add some light, bright, neon almost green and then tap in some of the darker colors into it so it has a softer green feel and it brings in some of that brightness that we see from the center of the flowers as well. Dropping in some darker green around this light area while everything is still wet is going to not only define this bud, which we really need to help it pop out, but also it provides another opportunity for some nice contrast because a lot of our leaves were painted wet on dry, and so they have that beautiful thick feeling. So it's nice to have some leaves that are watery and light, and we drop darker colors into it, and it gives us that wet on wet feel as well. So we can have contrast in using different techniques to create texture and color and feeling around our flowers. And the littlest bit of texture and color is going to go the longest way because we want to maintain some of that really bright watery area in the leaf, so we don't need to overdo it. Now, before we move on to the centers of the flowers, I'm going to add some more of those blue hard lines to the center of this one now that it's dry. We're not going to put any on those half circle petals because they are blocking their center. So just on those first three that we painted. And then on the left side of each of the buds and a couple of areas on the other flowers as well. Now we get to move on to the centers of the flower, or the stamen. And the stamen is made up of two parts, the filament and the anther. The anther is kind of the little dot at the tip, and the filament is the long, almost stem that connects it to the center of the flower. So first we're going to paint the anther. Now the anther on hawthorns, you gotta look up a picture. Bright pink, so long. The filament is so long. And there's only a few of them, and they're kind of a rectangle shape, small rectangles. So that's what we're going to do. I'm taking pure magenta, and I'm using just the tip of my brush to create these long but tiny strokes. And I want them to feel random, so you can see I'm being very thoughtful about where they're placed because I'm also thinking about the direction of the filament as I'm placing the anther. I'm thinking, how is the filament going to come out for this specific anther? And do I need to place one in a different spot in relation to the other anthers that are around it? So I'm just being very careful. And you can always go back and add more of these bright pink rectangles later if you feel like you don't have enough. Now that all of my greenery has dried, I want to deepen the contrast around some of the flower petals just a little bit. So I'm mixing my cad yellows, my deeper sap green, my ultramarine blue to get a very deep color. And it's a really subtle contrast. I didn't want it to be in your face because my leaves are already very dark, but just a line here and there to define around some of these edges, especially in areas that were really light. And also this is where I'm going to define more of those little green bits, the little sepals that are coming up on the flower buds. One thing I like to do when I'm adding the darker contrast of green is to use just the tip of my brush very lightly so that we can still maintain some of that green that we have as our base, and there's more of two colors shown together instead of one color taking over and being kind of laid on top. But I think this deeper contrasting color looks really nice right under some of these petals on the greenery, and we can leave most of that base layer of greenery. Usually this deeper color, when we are using it as contrast and shadow, a little bit goes a long way. So I'm just trying to look at the entire piece and see where I feel like it needs it. I'm also using a lighter wash of color around some of these lighter areas so we can add areas of contrast and depth within our lighter leaves. Even though they are a light wash to begin with, we don't need to add hard dark colors for definition. We can add some of these lighter colors to help define in lighter areas. So it kind of matches it more than that harsh, stark line we did on the other leaves. Just a nice, bright, still light wash, but it gives us a little bit more definition in some of these areas, especially around the petals and around that really light bud we have on the bottom. Now that our bright pink rectangular anthers are completely dry, we are going to paint the filaments. I'm using a bright lemon yellow, mixing that into the green we already have on our palette, and this wash is a lot more dry. It's a lot more pigmented with less water because we don't want blobs for the filaments. We're doing these tiny little lines connecting the anthers to the center of the flower, and we need a very precise stroke. So if you feel like you have too much water or too much paint on your brush, tap it on your paper towel, pick up some more paint with just the tip of your brush, and just very delicately drag from the anther to the center of the flower and keep it really light. I'm also curving my filaments a little bit because as they're coming out of the center of the flower, they're kind of curving up into the anther. So by curving your filaments, you can create a lot of interest instead of just doing straight lines from the anther into the center of the flower. Now I picked up a little bit more of a darker green that was next to the brighter green on my palette, and I placed that in the center where all of the filaments are meeting, just to create some depth within the center of the flower. And with that final detail, our hawthorn flower is finished. Now for me, this is part of a series, so I am writing Hawthorn and May, but this would be such a fun way to gift someone who has been born in the month of May a beautiful watercolor flower. Please let me know if you have any questions below. Thank you so much for being here while we painted this beautiful flower today, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys.